Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're finally going to discuss the Artemis II mission. A mission that's currently, when I'm making this video, is making history because for the first time in the last 50 years, humans have finally returned in the vicinity of the moon. And while there's already been quite a lot of media coverage that many of you have already probably watched, in this video we're mostly going to focus on some of the details and some of the facts, and actually some unusual facts, that have not been widely discussed and that most of you might not know about. In other words, let's discuss the Artemis II from a slightly different scientific perspective. But first, just some basics, just so that we're all on the same page. And well, as you probably know, this launched on April 1st, 2026. And though this could have been the most expensive April Fool's joke in history, it turned out to be real. And just like with the Apollo missions, this is a 10-day mission using the Space Launch System and the newly designed Orion spacecraft to basically test it and to determine how it performs later on when we do at some point land on the moon and hopefully establish a colony. Here's what this Orion spacecraft looks like, and this is basically where the 4 astronauts currently reside. But as you probably know, this is not a landing mission, and instead is a kind of a flight test. And specifically, it's actually going to be doing something like this. It's basically going to pass by the moon, go behind it, and then return back to Earth. So the spacecraft here is following a kind of a free return trajectory. Intriguingly, because of this, it doesn't actually have to fire its engines anymore, and it's basically going to return back to Earth because of the Earth's natural gravity. And here this mission is significant because it marks several firsts. And for me, as a Canadian, this is obviously a really important mission, because this also is the first time ever a Canadian actually got to reach the moon and travel beyond the low Earth orbit. But apart from this mission has already broken a very important record. The record for the farthest humans have ever traveled away from planet Earth. In other words, right here we have a picture of the Artemis II mission at the farthest point away from the planet, beating the previous record set by the Apollo 13 mission. This was actually during the emergency loop around the moon back in 1970. And so here the Artemis II has now officially reached the distance of 406,773 kilometers or 252,000 miles away from the planet, approximately 6,000 kilometers farther than before. So essentially it was somewhere at this point. And according to the astronauts, here the size of the moon resembles a basketball held at the arm's length. But as you probably know, they actually get to see the side of the moon that most of us normies never get to see, except for obviously pictures. In other words, they get to observe what's known as the far side of the moon, the side that looks entirely different. And because of this, NASA wants the astronauts to try to visually spot features that even satellites might have missed. Specifically, they want the astronauts to report different colors and different changes in brightness in order to help us understand the lunar geology just a little bit better. Mostly because, compared to a typical camera, human eye can actually detect subtle color changes and subtle brightness changes much better, something that many instruments very often miss. And so this is technically a chance to combine human perception with modern cameras in order to improve lunar science. As a matter of fact, some of the features here have never technically been seen to a human eye ever. And well, surprisingly, in just the last few days, the astronauts have already detected some really bizarre features. First of all, they experienced an unusual total solar eclipse. And that's because at some point during the transfer, the sun became blocked by the moon due to the unique position of the spacecraft. And here when the sun disappeared, it was actually gone for 57 minutes, much longer than a typical solar eclipse here on Earth. And during this time, astronauts observed what's known as the Earthshine. Light reflecting from Earth illuminated the lunar surface, making it bright enough to actually be able to tell certain features on the surface. And I'm sure during this time the astronauts took a lot of pictures, and so honestly I cannot wait for them to post them because it will be absolutely incredible. But during this time they also observed something that we never see. Basically here they acted as planetary defenders. They used their super advanced human eyes to spot at least 5 separate impacts or impact flashes resulting from tiny meteoroids hitting the surface of the moon in real time. Something that's almost impossible to see from planet Earth, but something that becomes pretty easy to see when you're so close to the moon and when you're in complete darkness. And so when it comes to planetary defense, this is a pretty important discovery, allowing us to figure out how many meteoroids strike the moon, which can then help us figure out how many similar objects potentially strike Earth. But apart from this, there's also actual science going on board involving several separate missions, and specifically certain advanced biological experiments that are meant to test several things. For example, one of the most fascinating experiments is known as AVATAR, a virtual astronaut tissue analog response experiment. And so here, before launch, doctors collected the blood samples from each of the astronauts and grew some of these stem cells from each of them, placing them into these tiny chips that were then deposited inside the capsule. And these organ-on-a-chip devices allow scientists to monitor how deep space radiation affects the astronauts' actual tissues in real time. This is done by comparing the same samples with the samples left on Earth that were basically formed in a very similar way. And so essentially here we have the space sample and the control sample. And one of the main goals here is to actually create some kind of a personalized medicine, mostly based on astronauts' own stem cells, that in theory could then be used by astronauts that are, for example, going to Mars, that can use their own stem cells to essentially treat their own body in case some kind of an injury or some kind of a damage. In other words, this is a very intriguing biological experiment that's going to show us how well this works and how outer space and radiation potentially affect stem cells compared to samples left on Earth. And here, trying to measure radiation is actually very important because, unlike astronauts on the International Space Station, the Artemis II astronauts travel beyond the Van Allen belts. So basically beyond the belts that protect us from cosmic radiation. And so that means that these astronauts are going to be exposed to a lot more radiation, whose effects on human body are still not actually well understood. And so the results from these studies are going to be quite important. But apart from this, there's also something referred to as the Archer study. This is actually a very important psychological experiment that's trying to evaluate how a 4-person crew handles the stress of isolation, the life in a very confined space, and communication delays, or even being unable to communicate with Earth for a prolonged time. And to do this, the astronauts are going to be wearing sleeping and movement monitors in order to track cognition and team dynamics. So here, by tracking their sleep, heart rate, and physical movement, scientists are hoping to see how the stress of deep space affects astronauts' cognitive health. And the main goal is to understand the type of resilience and psychological strength required for teams to perform high-stakes operations during long-duration missions, or basically to understand what kind of a person we need if one day the mission to Mars actually happens, because a mission to Mars would actually take at least 6 months compared to just 10 days for the Artemis II. Apart from this, there's also a study on the immune system, and specifically a biomarker study with scientists focusing on the immune system in zero-G conditions. And here the focus is to see if any of the dormant viruses inside astronauts reactivate. For example, viruses causing shingles or cold sores in the past have actually reactivated in astronauts living on the International Space Station. It's not entirely clear why this happens, but it seems to have something to do with unusual types of stressors in outer space. And to track this every day, the astronauts are required to collect their saliva and blood samples, which are going to be used to track these immunological biomarkers back on Earth. Then we have something referred to as O2 ICS. And this is a communication system, specifically an optical communication system that actually uses an extremely high-speed laser in order to see if we can transmit massive amounts of scientific data, including actually a 4K video. And so basically here, instead of using traditional radio waves like before, this spacecraft is going to be sending data much faster, possibly 100 times faster than was previously possible. And this is done by using lasers instead of radio waves. Now this is currently just a test, so we don't really know how well it's going to work, but it seems to function just fine for now. And then we have some really intriguing tidbits and unusual facts about what it's like to live in this capsule for 10 days and some of the cargo on board. For example, here some of the cargo involves symbolic but scientifically curious items. For example, here we have the seeds from the famous moon trees. The trees that were grown from the seeds that previously flew on the Artemis I mission, they have now once again been taken to space. In other words, this is a continuation of a kind of a multi-generational biological experiment just to see how space affects seed germination. But what about food? Well, here the menu includes 189 different items, including, surprisingly, 58 tortillas. And in the last few years, tortillas became a preferred space food for one simple reason. Unlike crackers or unlike other types of breads, they don't create crumbs and do not fall apart easily, which means that they're much safer for a lot of sensitive equipment that could be damaged by dust or crumbs that tends to fly into it in low gravity conditions. But unlike the Apollo astronauts, here the Artemis II mission even contains a kind of a briefcase-style food warmer, or basically sort of like a microwave oven, but in space. And for this mission, this is a kind of a luxury item, allowing astronauts to have warm food as opposed to typically cold food that a lot of other astronauts have been used to. But perhaps the most talked about technical innovation is the toilet. And here we're talking about a fancy titanium toilet, officially known as the Universal Waste Management System. And unlike earlier models, this allows for all of the waste to collect at the same time, and astronauts finally have a door for privacy, something that once again did not exist during the Apollo mission. And though there was an initial scare when astronauts reported some kind of an unusual smell and blinking fault light, this eventually got resolved and seems to have been fixed. And so the mission so far has not been without glitches. And as a matter of fact, apart from the unusual toilet problem, here the crew also dealt with a very bizarre issue involving frozen urine. Something that happens because of the toilet when someone peed. And well, to unfreeze the urine, they basically had to use manual heaters and had to even rotate the spacecraft toward the sun in order to melt the liquids. So yeah, somewhere in here there's some kind of a toilet joke that I cannot think of right now. If you have one, post it in the comments below. But apart from the hardware issues, turns out that they also had software issues. Mostly because NASA still uses Microsoft and Windows on board its computers. And well, it turns out that there were two versions of Microsoft Outlook, neither of which seemed to work correctly. And so it turns out that even in space, Windows still kind of sucks. But apart from these somewhat funny issues, there is one major concern that's currently stressing out some of the NASA engineers. This is in regards to the heat shield. Now here, if we look at this animation again, you'll notice that right around here, on April 10th, the spacecraft is going to return to Earth moving extremely fast. And that's of course the re-entry. And during the re-entry, the heat shield is very, very important. But turns out that last year, after the uncrewed Artemis I mission, inspectors discovered that some of the protective material contained unusual cavities and seems to have lost a lot of panels that was not anticipated. As a matter of fact, there was an unusual amount of charring that was much higher than expected. And at first this suggested that maybe the heat shield had to be redesigned. But despite this initial controversy, NASA still decided to fly Artemis II with the existing design, but instead modify the re-entry trajectory. And so here during re-entry, the capsule is going to approach at a much steeper angle and very likely move a little bit faster in order to reduce the time spacecraft requires in some of the most extreme heat. And that means that April 10th is going to be super scary and super stressful, both for these astronauts on board and of course the NASA team on the surface. And so hopefully nothing major happens. But that also means that after this mission, once it returns, there are going to be additional investigations and additional studies trying to discover how to optimize all of this and how to make the future Artemis III mission much more successful. And that's because Artemis III is going to be a lunar landing, bringing humans to the moon once again. And so right now, the plan for the Artemis is to have some kind of a lunar base by early 2030s. Now, obviously, we don't really know if this is actually going to happen, but either way, this is still a pretty exciting mission, even though technically humanity has done all of this already 50 years ago. And so on that note, we'll definitely discuss this more because there are going to be so many scientific discoveries from this, especially because this is the first time in 50 years that humans got to reach the point so far away from Earth where there's just so much more radiation. And what exactly this does to the human body, only time will tell. On that note, once we find out more, we'll discuss this in the next video. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.